Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream of the History of podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Markus Vinzent. And today today's discussion is going to be based on his book From Paul to Saul, Two Collections of Pauline Letters in the 2nd Century. Currently, it is out in German form. So if any of you are German readers, you can purchase the German version of the book. But the English translation is on its way. Markus, do you know yet when the English version might be out?
Yeah. First of all, hello, and thanks for inviting me back to the channel. The English translation is done, and it's at the moment in peer review with one of the major publishers. If that's going well, then I think that spring is the time when the book is going to be out for the English public.
And in the meantime, I'll have the link to the German version of the book in the description below and the pinned comment. And when the English translation comes out, I will add that in the description below and the pinned comment on this video.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe I should also add that this is the content extraction of a reconstruction that we as a team have done. So together with Mark Bilby, Jack Bull, and Kevin Lanthorpe. And that reconstruction, these are 3 volumes, are going to appear at the end of this month with Nah Franke in Tübingen, again, as a German version first. But the English translation is in the making, and that should come out sometime next year in English then with Peter's publishers.
Awesome. And before we continue, I also have the Patristica YouTube channel tagged in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. So if any of you haven't subscribed to that channel, you can do so now. As Markus Vinzent frequently appears on that channel with Jack Bull and Mark Bilby. All right. So the first thing I'd like to ask is, when you look at the 2 letter collections, were they, when Canonical Paul is expanding on the Marcionite edition, is it primarily an expansion of the Marcionite edition and also on a previous letter collection? Because you also talk about that the Marcionite edition is hinting to an earlier collection. So is the Canonical edition dependent on both collections, or just primarily just the Marcionite edition that's expanding?
Yeah, I think when you take that question, we have to assume that the Canonical collection is relying on both of those of what you just mentioned, right? Because if I'm not mistaken, then the Marcionite collection, as you rightly say, is not the first collection. It's the first collection that we can reconstruct, the earliest collection that we can reconstruct, actually. But as there is an indication, and we can talk about it a bit later, where that comes from, it seems that this Marcionite collection embraced not only one, but also relied already on 2 earlier collections. And one would think that's very complex, but it isn't, because when the Canonical collection is being created, they make use of the 10 letters that are being produced and being brought together in the Marcionite collection. And the Marcionite collection is already embracing those 2 earlier collections, and the textual expansion takes always place. So it's very rarely that these texts deviate very much from each other. Editors and redactors, like today, are pretty pragmatic people, pretty conservative people. So they take and accept, first of all, the text they have in front of them, which also means that when the canonical redactors take on Marcion's collection, they are also pragmatic. They first of all take what they've got, and then they make some of these minor changes. It is not actually very different from what we have in the gospel tradition, where we have synoptic gospels. And the only way or reason why we have synoptic gospels is because they were pragmatists. Yeah, they didn't invent the wheel a second time, but they made use of what they had in their hands, and they borrowed what they could, and they only made the changes where they thought it's worth doing some changes, right? And in the same way, we can think of that relation. But it also tells us, and the question you asked is the right question, it also tells us that we should not think of very different and very alienated groups in those times. I think these collections of letters of Paul had been produced in schools. Now we know that the Marcionite milieu is a school. So Clement of Alexandria says that he created a didaskalion, which means a schoolhouse, in Rome when he, after the Second Jewish War, when he moved together with other colleagues who also taught in Rome to Rome. So they are dispersed in a way after the Second Jewish War, make their way to either Ephesus, like Justin Martyr, and like Valentinus or Justin later, and then also Marcion a bit earlier. We think they create in this capital city of Rome, they create their schoolhouses. And as we can imagine, these schoolhouses in one city are, yes, they are competitive, like us today in academia, but they're also related. They know of each other, and they know of the products of each other. And just as Justin talks about the students moving from one didaskalion, from one school to another school, while they are still taught by the one teacher from whom they have moved away. So we have this interchange of students and of intellectuals. They know of each other, they borrow from each other, they build on each other, and they have their own takes of what this is.
So when was the Marcionite edition produced?
That we can know pretty well because we have good witnesses for that. They are all consistently saying that it was after the Second Jewish War. So that war ends in the year 135. In the years before, between 132 and 135, you couldn't do anything because there was war and you couldn't move very much. Yeah. But once that war was settled and a major refurbishment took place in Jerusalem and disbursement of Jews happened not just in Israel or Palestine at the time, but also in then Lebanon, or today Lebanon, so in Syria, in Asia Minor. And apparently those people who wanted to have a closer relation with the Roman government and also with Roman people, they moved to Rome. As we have it after the First Jewish War, when people like Josephus Flavius moves to Rome, and in Rome writes his major works of which we are dependent still today. And very similarly, we have after the Second Jewish War. So in the years after 135, people like Marcion, Valentinus, and others who move to Rome and there settle down and write the stuff which they need for their schoolrooms and which are then being distributed.
The other thing I'd like to ask you about is the chronology. You address the chronological things, the chronological arguments that scholars typically, the standard argument typically places the epistles in the 50s AD. What are the problems with those assumptions?
Well, the first assumption is, of course, we have no physical and also no literal witnesses, yeah, which give us these kind of datings, first of all. But secondly, I think, and more importantly, we don't have any physical evidence of individual letters. So it would be great, right, if we had, let's say, Romans on its own or one of the other letters. But all what we've got, I mean, consistently, everything that we've got, inclusive of papyri. So the earliest papyri that we have let's say the papyri 46 or 75 or others. The earliest papyri that we have show us letters within a collection. I mean, if we only have half a fragment, we don't know. But any papyrus which has some kind of consistency shows us letters in a larger collection. And very similarly, when people talk about, they rarely talk about just one single letter. Yes, we have in Clement where we have a singular, the letter is being mentioned, yeah. But then we can see from the bigger work of First Clement that he makes use of more than just the one letter. And we have parallel cases where somebody talks about a letter of John, but in fact, he means both letters, yeah. So what we've got is letter collections. And that's also what people refer to. So we have two letter collections which people are talking about. And this is the collection which is mentioned by later people. And as we can sift through their texts, they mean the so-called 14 letter collection. So that's what Irenaeus makes use of, Polycarp already makes use of. But then we have this other collection that is consistently addressed as the letter collection of Marcion, and this is a 10 letter collection. So now if we want to get the chronology right, we have our witnesses who talk about this 10 letter collection, which they credit to Marcion, Sinope, but talking and listening and teaching in Rome. And we have a 14 or 13 letter collection, depending on whether we count Hebrews in or not. And this is credited to the times of Irenaeus.
So when it comes to characters like Erastus, because I remember about 3 years ago when, I think it was 3 years ago, an archaeologist retested the dating of the Erastus inscription, and it was realized that, oh, wait a minute, unfortunately, this doesn't date to the 50s AD. It's actually a Hadrianic era, Emperor Hadrianic era inscription from the 2nd century. Well, I guess it ain't the same Erastus then. Well, what if it is, but the dating of the letters is what's wrong, not when Erastus lived?
Look, this is one of these interesting archaeological hints that we have, yeah. Right from the beginning, when the Erastus, I mean, just to make it clear for the listeners who have no clue what the Erastus inscription is, right? The Erastus inscription is a writing which has been found in the theater of Corinth. And in that inscription, there is what we call a procurator or a civil servant is being mentioned by the name of Erastus. And it is interesting that in Romans 16, in a Erastus is mentioned, who is the economist of the city of Corinth. And so the link has been made when this inscription was first found. However, from the beginning, when this inscription was found, the link was made, but it was obvious that the dating was not secured. And already the very earliest critical scholars who looked at the inscription were rather reluctant, because they knew that it is hardly an inscription which dates back to the 1st century. Now, that critical view has been established through the archaeologists over the last decades. So today we know it is a late Hadrianic slab which has been removed, and it's not the original location where we found it. So it's been removed, and it clearly locates Erastus into the mid-2nd century. But I think there is some potential link, yeah, between this Erastus and what we've got in Romans 16. And it's not necessarily to do with the dating of Romans. And that's, I think, one of the issues. People who take Romans in the 16th chapter form, as we have it, as the Romans that dates back to the years 50 or 60. They've got a problem with Erastus then, yeah? They have to assume at least 2 Erasti, or maybe 3. But if you think in a different chronology, we know, and Origen, for example, gives us a written witness that when he was looking at the letter of Romans, he knew at least of 3 different versions that he had in form of manuscript on his table. And he says there is a version of Romans which goes back to Marcion. And this is, in his view, an abbreviated form, because that Romans that he credits to Marcion is shorter than the other text that he has. But still, he has a second version of manuscripts which give us Romans. And he says, this is untempered, he says, non temerato or temeratus, so it's untempered by Marcion. But still, this, what he calls a Catholic version of Romans, ends at the end of chapter 14 and misses chapters 15 and 16, because he says the doxology, so the praise at the end, what we have today, at the end of chapter 16, those verses have been added or are at the end of chapter 14, which means 2 chapters are not only missing in Marcion's version of Romans, they are also missing in a of 2 versions of the Catholic collection. Now, when he says this version, which ends in chapter 14 with the doxology afterwards, yeah, has been untouched by Marcion, it can't be an abbreviated form as Marcion's, but it must be a fuller version, maybe the same version as we have it today, which means those chapters earlier, which are missing in Marcion's letter to the Romans, precisely, namely chapter 6 is missing, chapters 9 to 11 are missing, those chapters were present. Otherwise, Origen wouldn't have said it was untouched material. Yeah, so we have 3 different versions of Romans. 2 versions that end with chapter 14, one plus the doxology, another one with 16 chapters. Now the question is, of course, which of the 3 is the older one? Origen doesn't give us a solution. However, he gives an indication. And Goldman, who has written a recent book about Romans, has picked that up, because Origen says the doxology in this longest form of Romans that ends in chapter 16, he says, has the doxology where we ut nunc have it, where we just now have it. And Goldman is right, because that indicates that even in the eyes of Origen, the youngest, the latest edition of Romans is the one with 16 chapters, where the doxology is where it is now, as he says, with us. Which means we have one stage of a letter which is short. It's Marcion's letter, which is witnessed for the years around 100, let's say 135 or 140. Then we have a Catholic form, which has already the additional chapters 6 plus 9 to 11, but not 15 and 16. And then we have the full Romans letter as we have it today. And that brings me back to Erastus, yeah, on my chronology, which derives from the reconstruction of that 10-letter collection. Now we come to it why I think it's the earliest attainable at the moment version of those letters. Yeah, it would mean we have, first of all, a letter to Romans which is at least half only of the size and content what we today know of Romans. Then we have a first reworking of that short text by which those chapters 6 and 9 to 11 were added. And then we have a final version of Romans, which dates from around the times of Irenaeus, maybe a bit earlier, of the times of Polycarp, which means this is a letter which refers and relates back to the Acts of the Apostles. And it's no surprise that Erastus, Prisca and Aquila, a number of other people who appear in chapter 16 of Romans, you will find again in Acts, and you will find again in the pastoral letters. Actually, interestingly, also all other historical links, like the Erastus inscription, for example, the Gallio inscription, which gives us an inscription to a procurator in Caesarea, and Prisca and Avila, who has also a historical link because they are linked to the expulsion of Jews by the Emperor Claudius. Those historical anchors are all concentrated in Acts in 2 chapters, in chapter 18 and chapter 19. But they are also concentrated in Romans in chapter 16, in the chapter which appears, according to Origen, to be the latest addition to the letter to the Romans. And that gives us a clue how this came about. It came about that these chapters, like Romans 16, were added to the letter to the Romans when Acts was added to the collection, which then later forms the canonical New Testament. There is a second set of texts which also have a very close relation to Acts on the one side and also to Romans 16. And this is 1 Corinthians 16, where you somehow find similar people. It's also a list of greetings. And we have the pastoral letters. Now, interestingly, exactly those chapters and letters, and those letters were missing in the 10-letter collection in Marcion. They are also missing and are not quoted or hinted at by our earlier writers in the 2nd century. So they don't know of the pastoral letters. They also don't know of Hebrews. And the earliest version or the earliest hints where these letters are being mentioned are the times we are in the 160s. So that's the second school which we can trace. And that's the school of Polycarp, where Irenaeus comes from. And hence, it's not surprising that in Irenaeus' work against the heresies, you will find predominantly, when he talks about Paul, you find, first of all, you find Deuteropauline, so the 3 letters, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. And you find the pastoral letters, 1 and 2 Timothy, and the letter to Titus. So I hope I haven't confused you too much. But what I want to say is people like Erastus are, I think, just as Prisca and Aquila and as the Gallio text, these are historical things that people knew in the 2nd century. And they were used by the author of Acts and then also by the redactors of Romans and of 1 Corinthians to make these texts sound historically reliable and to go back to the 1st century. So it's not that the entire letter is not from the 1st century, but it's these particular elements, right, who wanted to give these letters a historical anchoring and a credit to make them sound as if they were written in the 1st century.
What are the links between these collections and Ignatius?
it is also interesting that there are some overlaps in personnel, but there are also some overlaps with regards to the school. Because when I talked about these two major schools which are involved in the redaction of these texts, then it is Marcion's school on the one side, that's located in Rome. Of course, he has links to Asia Minor because that's where he comes from. Sinope is in the north of today Turkey. It's in the north of Bithynia. So in the south of Bithynia, or in the west rather, you will find Ephesus. Ephesus and Smyrna, which is at the west coast of today Turkey, is the center of this second school, the school of Irenaeus, or where Irenaeus went to school, which is the school of Polycarp of Smyrna. He is a presbyter. He is the leader of not only a community, but Irenaeus gives us a lively portrait that when he was a younger student, he went to listen to Polycarp and to his school. And he says Polycarp was teaching in Ephesus. In Ephesus, in the Basilica of the Emperor. So apparently he either was even paid by the state and had an official chair, or he was able to teach in the Basilica. And there he says, and when we then look into the writings of Polycarp, unfortunately only one letter survived, we can see that in this letter we get access to those 27 texts which we later find in our canonical New Testament. So we have one school, which I call the canonical milieu, just because then later the canonical New Testament derives from it. So that's one school, Asia Minor, Ephesus, and Smyrna. And we have that second school, which is Marcion's school in Rome. I could add a few more schools, but that brings a bit more complexity. So keep those two main schools at the moment, because those are the most important one with regards to the writings we are talking about, Paul's letters, and also the Gospels. And these two schools apparently had interconnections. We know from Irenaeus that Marcion once made its way to see Polycarp. It wasn't a very amicable meeting, according to Irenaeus, but there was an exchange. And the same we get from Papias of Hierapolis, because he gives us a fragment where he says, yes, Marcion even took his books and his gospel to John and wanted his endorsement. John was neither very happy about the texts, but you can see that there is the attempt of exchange, of borrowing and of reading one's and each other's stuff. And they make use of each other's texts. That's how we can explain that.
So when you look at the Deuteropauline books and the Marcionite canon, Laodiceans, 2 Thessalonians, and Colossians, what makes you suspect that originally those 3 books were separate from the rest of the letters that formed a 7-letter collection prior to Marcion?
The first observation is always a macro observation from outside. You can see that the 3 letters stick together in the order of the 10-letter collection of Marcion. So we have different witnesses who give us the order of these letters. And Marcion's collection starts with Galatians, not with Romans like today, the 14-letter collection, but starts with Galatians. Then come 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Only then comes Romans. Then comes 1st Thessalonians. And here come in one pack the 3 letters, 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, and then Colossians. And only then comes Philippians and Philemon. So we have these 3 letters packed together in Marcion's collection, quite different from the canonical collection. Even in the old manuscripts, we have the 3 letters divided each by one of the 7 letters of Paul. Quite interesting. So I think it would be hardly possible that if one sets the order, or let's say the chronology, differently, and starts with the 14-letter collection that we have today, as New Testament scholars think that the 14-letter collection is the earlier one, and Marcion is an abbreviator of those 14 letters. But then we can hardly explain how the 3 Deuteropaulines end up in Marcion's collection as a pack, because that would mean that Marcion would have been a scholar of the 19th, 20th, 21st century New Testament studies. Because over the last 200 years, people have clearly seen that these 3 letters have a different lexicography, a different semantic, a different grammar, and also different theologies from the rest of the 7 letters. So first of all, the observation was these 3 letters stick together in one block in Marcion's collection. But when we did the reconstruction of the work, we also noticed then, when we were looking into grammar, style, even at that level, so forget about the canonical collection, even in that what is being witnessed as the 10 letters, we can clearly see a very different style from the 7 letters. I'll give you one example that's been around for decades, yeah? Long sentences. We have extraordinarily long sentences in those 3 Deuteropauline letters. Absolutely extraordinary. When you take the Nestle Aland, so our New Testament, the Greek New Testament that we have, yeah. So this is how it looks like. You will see that there are sentences, for example, in Ephesians, which run far above one entire page. So it could be a German Thomas Mann boundary of a sentence which finds no end. Similarly, you have such a sentence also in 2 Thessalonians. And you have a bunch of these types of sentences in Colossians. Now, the counter-argument that people sometimes put forward to say, oh, well, yes, these 3 Deuteropaulines have longer sentences and many more long sentences than we find in other of the Pauline letters. When then people bring other examples from Romans or from 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, interestingly, these are always texts from chapters and verses which are missing in Marcion's collection. And even so, in Marcion's collections, the 3 Deuteropaulines have less long letters. They still outshine the 7 letters of Paul to such an extent that even on the level of the 10 letters as they are witnessed for Marcion, you can clearly differentiate the 3 letters already, the 3 letters from the 7 letters of Paul. So this is one criterion, long sentence, but that was just one. We also can go into lexicography, in grammar, the way these letters are structured. And then it comes to theology. We have major differences in these 3 letters, even at the level of Marcion's collection, from the 7 letters of Paul. One of the most remarkable one is that Marcion's 7 letter of Paul do not know of the suggestion that women, for example, should be subjugating themselves to their husbands. But that is a typical marker for a canonical milieu, and it is present even on in Marcion's collection in the letter which is called the letter to the Laodiceans, and which then becomes later the letter to the Ephesians in the canonical version. So we have even theological and also ethical ideas which are typical for the canonical milieu, and which then are being brought into the canonical collection of the 14 letters, which are almost absent, or if present, only in those 3 letters, which I then, and therefore, think Marcion derived those 3 letters already from the school of Polycarp.
So why were these extra names added in the canonical edition from Acts? Was one of the reasons perhaps an attempt to backdate 2nd century individuals to the 50s AD, to the 1st century in the time, presumably in the time of Paul?
Yeah, you think historically. I think this is one way of doing it, by backdating people and their biographies. This is certainly also one of the interests, particularly to also give a surrounding to Paul. But I think there are 2 literary interests why those names have been added. First, yes, they locate the story in the 1st century, and that's why people use like Prisca and Aquila, like the dispersing of Jews from Rome in the years 40 under Claudius. The second element, I think, is as important to the editors, why they introduce these kind of names and place them in chapters like Romans 16, 1 Corinthians 16, in the pastoral letters, in Philippians 4, in Colossians 4, in Acts. And that is to create what Lücke, a good German young scholar, has written about the literary relation that's being created through Acts. He calls it the literary coherence. So it gives the reader who reads the canonical New Testament, where Acts is a cornerstone in the middle of the collection, it gives the reader the impression this entire collection has always been a collection from the beginning. It's not something that grew, it's not something that's been redacted at some point, but it was given. You could say it's a very similar impression as the Quran is being portrayed as given as a one go by the divine. And so you get an idea of a bridging text which reaches out in those different subgroups of texts into the 4 Gospels, into Paul's letters, into, of course, the Catholic letters that come with Acts and has always been regarded in the manuscripts of the first hundreds of years as a subgroup, just like the 4 Gospels, as a subgroup where Acts belongs to the Catholic letters. And it's no surprise, because with Acts, you get the major players. You get Peter, and you get James, and you get John. And look, these are exactly the letters that are appended to Acts in this subgroup. So when you read Acts, you not only get the personnel, which reaches out into these different groups of texts, you get also the letters of those early apostles. And only after Acts plus those Catholic letters are being placed after the Gospels, then we come to read the 14 letters of Paul. And so after you have read Acts, you rediscover these people in Romans 16 that you have mentioned or seen mentioned in Acts before. And so you remember what Acts talked about and the stories and how and what happened. And then you read these people again in these chapters of the Pauline letters and beyond. So you remember those. Hence, it comes back and gives this impression of the overall collection. And the same happens with names, not just of people, but also of places. You only need to look into Revelation, the last book of that 27-book collection of the New Testament. You will find cities. The first praised city, slightly criticized, but the main one which is praised is Ephesus. The last of the 7 places that are mentioned and heavily criticized is Laodicea. And then we have got the explanation why the letter, which in Marcion's collection, and I guess even in the Catholic 10-letter collection, is directed not to Ephesus, but to Laodicea, according to the manuscripts and the information we have. In the 14-letter collection, so our New Testament, the canonical one, this letter has been readdressed no longer to the Laodiceans, but now is being called a letter to the Ephesians. So once you have the collection as a full collection of 27 letters in front of you, you can understand what and why the names are shifted and are placed in these places, because they make that entire collection coherent.
What do you think the literary agenda of Acts was? Was Acts working from the Marcionite edition of the Pauline epistles and trying to create a new story about Paul?
I think it's a continuous process. The first attempt, I think, of the canonical school of Polycarp was to make use of Marcion's collection. So what they did is they used this one gospel and they multiplied it. So different students, I guess, and different people within that school created out of this one gospel their own versions of this gospel. More linked to the school were those three that we know now under the names of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke is the closest to Marcion's text. Matthew and Mark are slightly more deviating from the text. Then we have John, of course. John also refers and is building on Marcion's text, also on the other two texts, but is on the brink and on the edge, I think, of that school, is more referring and more influenced, I think, by Valentinian thinking, which is another school that also existed in Rome. So that was the first attempt. And in parallel, I think, those 10 letters that existed in Marcion's collection were also reworked by attempting to remediate some of the ethical and theological issues that people in the school had with the views of Marcion. So that was the first attempt. These 10 letters together with the 4 Gospels, have been known by Marcion in Rome too. So he knows what is going on in the school. He knows that these texts have been reworked, and he complains about it. And that was the issue why he sits down, and as he says in the preface, which unfortunately is only in fragments and in hints available to us, but we can see so far from that preface, the antitheses, that Marcion, as a result of that reworking of his texts, sat down and brought the gospel and his 10 letters of Paul in a collection. And this collection he gave a name, namely New Testament. It's the first time that this name is being deployed according to what we know. And interestingly, nobody in the 2nd century, when talking about the New Testament, means any other collection than Marcion's New Testament. One's own, the 27 books containing collection, neither Polycarp nor Irenaeus nor Tertullian in the beginning of the 3rd century ever call New Testament. They have no name for it yet. When they talk about the New Testament, it's always Marcion's one Gospel, 10 letters of Paul collection. So, your question about Acts. Once Marcion had his New Testament published, and published I mean in the modern sense, it must have been a collection that carried a preface, and in the preface it was clear it was Marcion's collection, because he gave it the name, his name, to the preface. The gospel was an anonymous gospel, and the letters were Paul's letters according to Marcion's New Testament. But once that collection then existed in Rome, and certainly was also read by Polycarp's school, they saw the need to do more. It wasn't enough to have 4 Gospels, about which this preface complains. It wasn't enough to have a revised version of these 10 letters, as we have seen in Origen, so with additional chapters 6, 9 to 11. That wasn't enough. And I think it was the further development in the school that people like Irenaeus, potentially even Polycarp, sat down and created a competitive, bigger collection of early Christian writings that matched somehow Marcion's New Testament. But instead of 1 gospel, they brought together these 4. And instead of 10 letters from Paul, they added 3 more. First 3, and then another one, Hebrews, 4 more. So the pastoral letters and Hebrews. But also they brought, in addition, the book of Acts. Whether the book of Acts was exclusively written in this school for this purpose is still a question which we need to discuss and research. All I can say is that the major thrust of Acts, as it's been employed in putting together the canonical collection, was that it was certainly revised, edited, like all the other texts. I mean, the Gospels were re-edited and part harmonized. The 10 letters of Paul became re-edited and part harmonized with the new 3 and 4 letters. And the 3 and 4 letters, so the pastorals and Hebrews, I don't think they were exclusively just written for this purpose. They might have existed in rudimentary form already, but they were integrated and were extensively revised, because the entire collection, including Revelation, show, with all the differences in content, in language, grammar, and so forth, they show enormous consistencies across the board of the 27 books. And that shows that we are dealing with a substantial rewriting of all of these 27 writings just to make them fit. Not entirely, there are inconsistencies, but pretty much fit a general purpose. Now, what was the general purpose? I think it was giving the Christian community a collection of texts which satisfied the needs of the late 2nd century. First of all, the question, what is the relation between Christians and Jews? Second, what is the relation between Christians and their pagan environment, particularly the Roman government? And so a chapter beginning, chapter 13 of Romans, 13:1 to 7, has been added at that late stage, with Acts, pastoral letters, Revelation having come in. And so for that particular purpose, I think Acts has been substantially written or rewritten.
What does Justin Martyr say about Marcion?
Unfortunately, he must have written a book which is lost. And that is a book which is called a book to Marcion, not against Marcion. That was his first attempt. And in that book, apparently, he addressed questions and discussed it with his colleague. In which critical way, we don't know, but it was not a book already against somebody who then later becomes a heretic. No, it was I think it was a study and response to Marcion. Unfortunately, we only have a small fragment which is being preserved in Irenaeus, but we have, fortunately, both the Latin translation of that fragment, including the Greek text. And both texts are pretty clear. It is a text which is directed to Marcion. Only Eusebius, when he first quotes Irenaeus in Greek, he gets it right. He says, yeah, it's pros Marciona, so it's to Marcion. When he later reflects in his church history about this book, he calls it a book against Marcion. which is quite different from what Irenaeus says, and he himself quotes in earlier places. But I tell you, when we today look into our church histories, which is being taught up and down the countries, you will always read that Justin wrote first a book against Marcion, which is wrong. Now, the text that we have received, and don't forget, we only have one single manuscript for Justin's works. So that these works survived is a miracle. Fortunately, the miracle happened. But we only have one single manuscript from a pretty late date. So in the outgoing medieval times. What does he say there? He's getting harsher because these are texts from the 160s. So we are exactly at the time frame where people start putting together the canonical writings and do the rewritings of Marcion's collection. And here he is trying to style Marcion's text as a devilish text. So he doesn't leave anything positive added. As a result, he stays away from Paul's letters because I think he has associated these letters still too much with the one he is attacking and criticizing. But he also stays away, in some way, from these canonical rewritings of the Gospels, because he makes use of material from the Gospels, but they're never in the precise form, as we have them either in Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. So people were wondering what's going on with Justin, but he is a clear witness that he is an anti-Marcionite, or has become an anti-Marcionite by the years 160 following. And yet, he's not fully behind the Catholic or the canonical New Testament writings either. When he makes a big case, let's take, for example, the period of suffering of Jesus. He almost entirely throws his information out from Psalm 22, not from the passion narratives of the Gospels. So it shows a great reluctance towards New Testament, or what we call New Testament writings. And I think that's still to do with the authority which these texts are having. And the authority is that still of Marcion. So the skepticism which has grown in Justin to Marcion is reflective of the reluctance in using precisely those canonical texts.
So I'll take a couple of super chat questions real quick. Michael E., thank you for your super chat. Any precedents for letter collections that present as work of single author yet reflect contributions from multiple hands, decades, or even regions?
Yeah, I think we have parallels. One of the parallel, which is the most obvious one, is of course the letters of Ignatius itself. When you see the development of that collection, you can see a very parallel development. We have, first of all, a collection of 3 letters. Just interestingly, a letter written by Ignatius to Polycarp, where on the one side he praises Polycarp, on the other side he criticizes him. So a strange mixture in this letter to Polycarp. Then we have a letter to the Romans, and we have a letter to Ephesus. So you see, it's first of all the personnel is not so different from the Pauline letters. But then what happens? These letters, the 3 letters, seem to also have derived from around the end of the Second Jewish War. Maybe 1 or 2 of these letters are earlier. Maybe, if Jack Bull is correct, they might go back to a historical Ignatius from the years beginning of the 2nd century, who potentially was a martyr. I don't know. because we have some of these letters individually transmitted, like the letter to Polycarp and the letter to Romans. But then, as a collection, it was brought together, I guess, around the same time when the Marcionite collection was put together. And then come 4 new letters, which are also of different style and quality, pretty much like we have them in the Canonical collection. And again, I think they derive not from just one hand, but from different hands, but then have been redacted by 1 or 2 people. So that I think is a parallel case. But then we have also other letter collections. We have Nina Livesey gives a whole list of letter collections, which have been attributed to great sophistic teachers from the 1st and the 2nd century before our time, and also of our time. And as she shows in her book on the Pauline letters, just appeared a few months ago, it is the nature of the time that schools and several people collect different texts and credit them, edit them, put them together and give them as a authoritative collection to a big name, because big names need letters. I give you from antiquity, which is also being used in Livesey, one example, and is an example we just discussed a few weeks ago in the colloquium in Leuven on 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because people make the case that 2nd Corinthians might be a collection of letters, probably 5 or 6 letters, and not just a single letter. But when I talked to one of my philological colleagues there, he brought in his lecture on multiple letters being brought together in collections. He brought the example of Plato. Now, of Plato, we have 7 letters, or even more. And nobody, at least no critical scholar today, thinks that one of these letters that are credited to Plato is authentically Platonic. And then again, they are so different in length, in nomenclature, in content, in language, in grammar. Most closely related are potentially letters 8 and 7. And somebody who thinks of authenticity takes those 2 letters probably as the most likely to be authentic, for the very same reasons as one takes Acts and chapters like Romans 15, 16 and 1 Corinthians 16 as authentic, or Philippians 4. Why? Because there's so much personal biographical information packed into these letters that people say, well, if Plato hasn't written it, who would have known all that is what's going on around him, in him, and the relations? But critical scholarship who think about these pseudepigraphical writings of letters, the forgeries of letters, they say this is the marker of forgery. Every good forger, it's like a thief today. Every good thief thinks about the story. What can happen with the traces that he leaves? And he builds around a consistent, hopefully, a consistent form that secures him for being not detected. And the more truth claims you make, the more complex it gets. And this is particularly a feature of forgery. So Plato, the times of the sophists, Ignatius, we could carry on.
Solar Knight, thank you for your super chat. God is a myth. No human being has ever truly defined God outside of books. God equals X minus X equals nature.
Yeah, well, that's a very philosophical and maybe a philosophical and a theological question. I have a personal problem with replacing now God or theology with the idea of a myth. Myth and mythology are relatively modern names that serve as substitutes for philosophy and theology. And a similarly difficult idea and concept, of course, is God. The ancients, when they were talking about the gods, and even about the singular, about God, had very different views from what we associate today with divines. Maybe we are too much taught by those stories and those mythologies that derive from stories like our canonical texts, but then also all these mythological texts, which we call what we call today mythological texts, right? Stories of cultures, story of traditions of other religions that's been around since people write and can think. It is interesting that the oldest types of writings that we have, and these are the bone fragments from about 4,000 to 12,000 for our time, know already that people talked about gods, particularly female gods or goddesses. So that's around since people apparently can reflect and put those reflections onto, not books actually, but onto bones, onto stones, later onto papyri, into leather, in walls, wherever you can think about. It is interesting when you say God minus God is nature. Probably we have to turn it, the story, if we historically think about that concept, the other way around. It's the experience of nature that brought people to reflecting about those powers which they can't control. And maybe that's one of the ways. I've got Jörg Rübke, who always talks about the divine or the divines as those super human powers who you can't control. Now, if you're very honest, it is already very difficult to control yourself, let alone to control your partners, your friends, your kids, your grandparents. Control is not a possibility, but it is the anxiety that brings people to think about those potential controls and ideally controls that you can influence. I still think that Feuerbach doesn't get it too wrong to think about those divines, not just in terms of nature, but also in terms of extrapolations of our anxieties and hopes that we have. Not sure whether this satisfies you, but the opposite side you get with people like Plato, and then people like Marcion, about whom we talk about today. Because in those 10 letters of Paul, the divine is a super transcendent divine. It's somebody who you can't control and of whom you are even not dependent in a way, because this is a divine that is unknown to human beings. So human beings are not portraying their ideas into it, but they're confronted by it. And when I was reading these 10 letters, I could have easily imagined that somebody like Karl Barth would have loved to know these letters, because so much of his dialectical thinking is embedded in these letters, because it's a transcendent that is coming down in this world. It's not the creator, because this creation has limits, but this divine is limitless. It's also being embedded in this world, not just in a human being. No, it is a limitless being. It doesn't need an ascension. It's here and it's not here. And it still, and that I like with these letters, it still has a positive message, because it says, well, even though the environment is problematic, the world is problematic, there is hope in this world. And hope lies, and he sums it up, he says, the entire law, everything that we would can think about, relations between ourselves, is summed up in love. What a nicer idea can you have?
Was Acts also trying to rework Marcion's Paul in light of the canonical Gospels?
Yeah, indeed. You can see that with the opening of Acts. It starts with what I just mentioned, actually. Acts starts with the ascension. And the revision that Luke brought on Marcion's gospel was that the gospel that in Marcion ended with the resurrection. And then the sending of the students and apostles into this word. That wasn't enough for Luke. For him, he needed to do something with a physical being which has been created in those years, where Christ is no longer a more than human being, but he becomes born from a woman, brought up. And what do you do with this type of a physical being? It needs, just like Muhammad, being lifted into the air and disappears in heaven. So this is, let's say, one could say, a trivial way of getting rid of this kind of a divine physical human being. But that's the way it was. So that's the way Luke, the Lucan redactor, reconstructs that. And this is exactly how Acts, when it was redacted, I think, picks it up, because that's where Acts starts with. A second rewriting is added straight after the ascension story. It is the replacement of Jude. Of course, Jude, as one of the 12, as the canonical Gospels tell us, are representing Israel. So 12 tribes of Israel are represented by those 12 apostles. And that's why the number 12 is so important, not only to the canonical Gospels, but particularly to Luke and to Acts. And so the election, of course, by the Spirit, by accident, and you can see how mythology here comes in, is being chosen, that Jude is being replaced by Matthias. And then the conditions are being mentioned. Who can be one of the 12 apostles? So one of the followers of the tribes of Israel. And Acts says, only somebody who has been with the 12, with us and Jesus, from his baptism by John up to the ascension. So you can see that excludes immediately Paul. Paul has not been present at Jesus' baptism, neither has he been present at the ascension or resurrection. He has never seen the physical body. He has never seen Jesus of Nazareth. So Acts is counteracting the authority of Paul. And even so, that from chapter 8, and more particularly from chapter 9 onwards, it seems to become a story about Paul. The entire biography that Acts develops for Paul is a softening of and a rewriting and a refabrication of Paul, so that people who are tempted to reading his letters, not these 10, but the revised 14 letters, after they have read Acts, the Catholic letters, then they are prepared to read those 14 letters in light of Acts. So Acts is really putting the glasses on the reader's eyes, so that I couldn't read Paul just now. No, you need Acts on the one side and the Catholic letters on the other side, and only then you will be able to read and understand Paul as Acts wants us to understand him. And that's why I called this new book From Paul to Saul, because it is a move from the Pauline letters as we have them, not the original ones, but in the earlier version, the pole of the 10 letters are being moved to become a soul, which then is a kind of a soul who is by divine interaction becoming only pole. So there is an intermediate stage being put around the figure of Paul, a pseudo-historical figure. And that's the main intention, I think, of Acts. It's the couching of Paul with the sugar-sweet soul around it, and also showing that he is not fully trustworthy. And that comes so through in most of the redactional elements that the canonical writings put on top of the 10 letter that as we have them in Marcion's collection.
Daniel Bradford, thank you for your super chat. If the Pauline letters were objectionable, why not disregard them instead of domesticating them?
Good question. I think you have both options in the 2nd century that are being followed through. You have people like Justin who simply disregard these letters. We have also later Melito of Sardis disregarding these letters. We have a number of other authors from the 2nd century disregarding these letters. You will not find a word, not even a hint at Paul in the Shepherd of Hermas. An extensive work, 60 chapters on early Christian life in Rome. Not a single word about Paul, no idea taken from Paul. For example, even not the resurrection of Christ. It doesn't appear, despite the center that the resurrection of Christ plays in Paul. In Hermas, Shepherd, nothing. The earliest catechism that we have, the Didache. So this is a catechism that brings people and accompanies people how to become a Christian. There's not one single word, no hint, no debate, nothing that relates these chapters, 16 chapters, with Paul and his letters. Nothing at all. Here people are introduced into Christianity, and whatever the date of this Didache is it late 1st, is it mid-2nd century, is it late 2nd century, is it, as some colleagues think, 3rd century? It's certainly used throughout the 1st millennium, because we can find the text again and again in other early Christian, early medieval Christian collections of legal and liturgical texts. This text is silent about Paul. So we have one of your options. Disregard this chap. The second option, why? Well, if you have a substantial textual corpus that seems to have power, seems to know if only a few sentences from Christ, and has a reasonable distribution, then the second option is, yes, you make use of it, but you pick what you want and you rewrite it in the way you think it should be better. So that's domestication. And the third option, which you haven't mentioned, is what we just discussed with Acts. Tertullian gives us the third option. He says, if I read Acts, then I can digest Paul. So only with those glasses can I read, and also can I accept those letters of Paul. Without Acts, I would have to reject them. He rejects other writings like the Acts of Paul, because our Acts are not the only Acts of Apostles that have been written. We have an epistle of the Apostles, which is a type of Acts. We have another, which is the Acts of Paul. we have more than that. We have a whole bunch of acts which have never made it into the New Testament. But all of them are the attempts to rewrite the story of Paul and of other apostles and to give them a different biography. So the third option is you write not only new letters, but you write them a story and couch them and direct that person into the direction where you want these people to act. So it's like creating a stage, and you deploy what is on the stage, and you make those figures move the way you want to have them moving. And then you can also implement letters, particularly if you then have changed and altered the content of these letters as much as you want.
We'll take the next super chat. Slower 953 super chat. Paul healed a lame man in Lystra. The crowds attempted to worship him and Barnabas, mistaking them for gods.
That's one of those mythological stories, I would say, which is part of Acts, of course. Yeah, that is one typical thing which you don't get from either of the 10 letters of Paul. Even from the canonical letters, you get hardly a sense that Paul is being portrayed as a healer or as a miracle worker. But that is a very powerful story which is being created through Acts. In Acts, he becomes also the big organizer. And to be a big organizer is to work wonders. And one of the wonders, which is then also being implemented into the canonical 14 letters, is that these wonders happen. More explicit, of course, in Acts than it is in those letters. But one of the big wonders is, of course, this miraculous money production, the collection for the community in Jerusalem. 2 entire chapters of the second letter to the Corinthians, chapters 8 and 9, are only dealing with this money creation and collection. It's absolutely incredible. 2 chapters which are missing in Marcion's 2 Corinthians. And it's interesting to see that scholars today debate whether these are isolated letters which have been plugged in to an earlier or a different or a compound letter, which we now call 2 Corinthians. So it's wonder working, it's missionary work, those missionary successes of which Acts talks about, hundreds, thousands fleeing towards the Christian community, building a wave of a new religion. That is what people have adopted, have loved, and became. You only need to look into art history from late antiquity onwards, throughout the medieval period until today. That is what becomes the colonial, big, successful world religion that is being implemented through this type of a canonical collection.
The standard view typically takes that the canonical Pauline epistles don't quote from the canonical gospel, so they predate the canonical gospels. Where do you see evidence of the opposite of this being the case?
Well, there are loads of small little cases where you can see that it's not about quoting in the proper sense, but it is about relating to each other. We had one example now, the idea of how he is part of, in the canonical collection, part of this resurrection business. So we have 1 Corinthians 15, for example, which tacks in and is closely related with the resurrection appearances in the canonical Gospels. And even these resurrection appearances in the canonical Gospels don't seem all to go back to the first century. they also seem to be part of that kind of redactional process. I give you one example. Mark, we know that Mark in manuscript form has a short ending, and in the broader manuscript tradition has a longer ending. Now, in the short ending, we don't have a resurrection appearance. And people have always wondered, why that? And it's quite clear why then, at some stage, presumably later, because why would somebody cut out a section where Jesus appears and just leave it? No, that's why scholars think that the resurrection appearance that exists at the end of Mark 16 is being added later in light of the other explanations of the death of Jesus, as, for example, in Matthew and in Luke. So things are redacted. And very similarly, we have, when you compare the 1 Corinthians in Marcion's text and compare it with 1 Corinthians in our canonical collection, you can see that the resurrection appearances are missing. And why are they missing in 1 Corinthians 15? Because in our canonical collection, it is linked to the hierarchy within the apostles. And it replicates what we just discussed about the beginnings of Acts. In our canonical text, it says that Paul transmits what he has been received himself. That's already missing in Marcion's text. And then comes the hierarchy. We have Jesus first appearing to Cephas, then to the apostles, then to James, then to hundreds. And at the end, he appears to poor Paul, who calls himself the least worse of receiving a resurrection appearance. He is almost not worth to be named an apostle. Precisely what Acts does. He doesn't call him a proper apostle. So we see how it's not quoting, it is interlinking between the canonical revised Gospels and the revised Pauline texts and Acts, of course. And so you can see how the redaction works. It is interlinking these texts also on the content level, not just with names or locations, but also content-wise, so that we get a different Paul. Now a Paul who is no longer the sole authority as in Marcion's collection, but he is the least of the apostles. He is not one of the 12. He is an after apostle, as Tertullian calls him.
JC, thank you for your super chat. Joseph Smith dictated his fictional Mormon scripture, and scholars show wove his own life into the lead character's Nephi. If Marcion composed or edited the 10 letters, do you see evidence he did the same?
Very good question. Jack Bull knows much more about Joseph Smith and all the Mormon scriptures, so don't get me wrong. I only know what I know from Jack Bull, but I know I get your question, and I've thought about it also at length. Is there something in these letters of Paul, and even in the Gospel, of course, which gives us a potential reflection of Marcion, whether he is the author or whether he's a serious editor? And there are hints. First of all, I have to admit, Marcion, by all respect, is not a Shakespeare. So he doesn't just write these texts out of himself. He makes use of 2 Pauline collections. So he gets some texts, and not only individual texts, collections, which he embedded in his own publication. And very similarly, I think, happens also with the Gospel. And I have to correct myself. You learn when you do research, hopefully. And I've learned, for example, from the reconstruction of Paul, that my earlier view is that Marcion wrote this Gospel from either from oral information or information which he scrapped together seems to be wrong. I'm more inclined today to think that as he makes use of earlier Pauline collections, he also makes use of earlier material, potentially earlier gospel versions like Q, or like the Gospel of Thomas, or like an earlier version of his own gospel. He's also a pragmatist. But your question, how much does it, or is there still an element of self-portrait in those texts? And here I would say yes. Scholarship across the board has always seen that Luke has the best Greek of all the Gospels. So it seems to go back to an editor or redactor who knew his Greek. Paul's Greek is of a similar style, similarly good. Maybe because the redactor makes use of earlier collections, they are different. We have, I think, a slightly better Greek and in the canonical tradition as in the 7 letters, which are not as polished as, for example, a letter to the Ephesians, or even more later, the letter to the Hebrews. Origen already says the person who has written Hebrews, he couldn't have written those other letters of Paul. Impossible. Hebrews is a fine Greek. The letters are, they are Greek, but they're not of that standard. Now, Luke, the Gospel, I think, also has a finer Greek as those other 7 letters of Paul. So one portrait is that a teacher like Marcion, who has money, who has a teaching background, who has learned his lessons, who is a rhetorician, yes, that comes across in those texts. Hence, the people who plagiarize him, Mark, Matthew, John, they really are of second nature with regards to the language. They are just less. And that's what people always have seen. Let's come to content. People also have always seen that the Gospel of Luke is the most commercially oriented Gospel. When you compare the similes, the examples that are given in the Gospel of Luke compared to the other Gospels, money plays a big role. Commercial activities play a big role, a much bigger role than in all the other Gospels. If you come from a commercial background like Marcion, it is quite obvious that you would place your protagonists, the people you write about, in those areas which you know best about. He was a ship owner who was trading in the ship industry. I can imagine why those disciples of this protagonist, Jesus, are not wine producers, but are fisher. One might think and start laughing about it, but if you ask that question, but why was Jesus not going into agricultural disciples? No, he goes to the lake of Gennesaret. So it might be a hint, might be a reflection of a redactor, could be more. These are hypotheses, yeah? I have no idea, but it could be a reflection of his own trade. Take the letters of Paul. They are all from, with the exception of Galatians, which is addressing people in the location where Marcion comes from. But the other letters are all from port cities. So if you are a trader, you place your protagonist in those places which you know. And he knew those port cities because he was dealing with ships in ports. He rented ships out. Again, is it coincidence or is it a reflection of the editor? He's a big ascetic person. And if Tertullian is right, and Harnack picked on it, he seems to have been not born a Jew, but he only became a Jew as an adult. Does it reflect? Yeah, it seems to reflect, because there is the question of circumcision and the question whether you can become a proper spiritual Jew, as Paul says in this letter collection, not only of Marcion, but also in the canonical version. Can you become a real Jew, a spiritual Jew, without circumcision? And he says, yes. Is that a reflection? Yeah, it could be. And I think it could be explained that these real issues are issues that have been of concern to this redactor himself.
What are the differences in viewpoints on marriage and the role of women in the Marcionite edition and the Canonical edition?
That's a very interesting question, because in Marcion, it says that marriage is allowed. There are gifts, and to these people, like Paul himself, who is unmarried, and then you have the gift of people who can marry. But the difference is that in Marcion's 1 Corinthians 7:1, it is clearly said that even if you marry, you cannot have sexual relations within marriage. You should better not marry, but if you are married or if you marry, that is the end of sexuality. So Christians who join that community have to be fully ascetic. Of course, that's not the recipe for creating a world religion, because if you have no offsprings, it's very difficult to have a second generation following the first. But that is one of the examples of extreme asceticism in early Christianity. However, it is not the most extreme, because at least he allows women and men to live together as couples. And the impression I get when I did the reconstruction of these texts is that Marcion is already watering down an even stricter ascetic idea that was earlier on present in that Jesus movement, which says that when he says, well, yes, we allow marriage, it is like an alleviation of a stricter condition that existed before. And in that respect, is the canonical tradition only taking that alleviation further by stating, well, it's not just that we allow marriage, but you can also have offspring. And for that purpose, you can have a sexual relation, but only for that purpose, not for lust and not for pleasure. So we stick to this Marcionite asceticism in this respect. Even within the canonical tradition, and you can see how little the Marcionite milieu and the canonical milieu in the 2nd century are distinct milieus. They are overlapping milieus. Because we have this very interesting letter exchange between Dionysius of Corinth, a canonical and a Catholic bishop of Crete, of Corinth, of course, but who writes to Crete, and there to a bishop of the name of Pinetus. And he admonishes Pinetus to state he shouldn't be as strict and ascetic as he is with his congregation. And because Dionysius writes also a letter against Marcionite tradition, so it seems that Pinetus was at least in a similar trail as Marcion was with regards to marriage and sexuality, or renouncing of sexuality. And Pinetus is pretty hard-nosed. So he writes back to Dionysius of Corinth, and he says, well, you shouldn't better write that to me, because we are not serving our community milk to children. I'm dealing with adults, and these can stand that form of asceticism that I'm teaching. Hence, you can see in the 2nd century, it wasn't the norm that people were marrying and having sexual relations and having offsprings. It is a big debate in the 2nd century how to regulate this kind of ethical behavior. Hence, we can see Marcion is not the strictest end, but he is, let's say, part way between an absolute asceticism where you don't marry, where you only live your life on your own, and a community which exists of people who are unmarried, like the protagonist Paul, and people who are married, like Peter and like others. And then we have a canonical milieu, which takes that even further and says, no, we can have normal relations. And you can see the further in history it gets, right, the stronger that normal life milieu becomes. The ascetic milieu never dies out. Throughout the late antique period, as well as through the medieval period, until today, we have orders, we have ascetic people, we have people who renounce marriage, and we have a big debate about the celibacy of the Catholic priests. So the debate carries on, but it becomes already livelily being seen in the transition from the 10-letter collection of Marcion into the 14-letter collection of the canonical authors. And very interestingly, when you look into the pastoral letters, so the latest addition to the canonical writings with Hebrews, there you can see that these are the strongest advocates for a normal way of life. Here it is that the bishop becomes married. People, the deacons are married. People are married. People who direct the community are married and have sexual intercourse. Yeah, they drink wine. So it's a normalization of life that takes place the longer the canonical process works. And this is the collection which then makes its way. And to be fair, this is the only collection which could have produced a world religion. Marcion could have never.
What about Paul's views on eschatology? What are the differences there between the Marcionite and the canonical editions?
We have a parallel development, as I just depicted it, about ethics. I think before Marcion, as far as we can draw it out from these earlier collections, as far as we can sense those, the eschaton has already taken place. It is the beginning of the eschaton. I mean, this is the only reason why you have such an ascetic drive, because you think within our generation, it's like those Jehovah's Witnesses, right? It's within reach. We will not grow old. We will not see our children grow up. It's time is the we're right at the end. And that's still predominant in the 10-letter collection of Marcion. You can see it and sense it from 1 Thessalonians. You can even see it from his version of 2 Thessalonians. It's the end is imminent. It's the son of darkness. He's coming, and he will sit in the temple. He will pose as the divine, and there it is. It's the end coming. And that is much relaxeder, more pushed away. You can see it in the canonical Gospels that people say, oh no, we don't know the day when he will arrive. And similarly, in the revised version of particularly of 1 Thessalonians and then 2 Thessalonians, we can't say when it will happen. And then the pastoral letters, there are hints, but those are remote hints. I mean, we have to settle. We have to We have to live with this life, and the divine will come without telling. Yes, we have to be prepared, but it will happen at some day, maybe in hundreds of years, 1,000 of years, maybe we cannot tell.
Does the Marcionite editions, does the Paul and the Marcionite edition have similar views of Jesus Christ that Marcion's gospel has?
Yeah, they coincide so neatly, which I think I would love to draw out a bit more in detail. It's not just the vision of Christ. It's, as I show in this book on from Paul to Saul, it's definitely almost all the sections that we can look at, the image and the thinking about the divine himself, the thinking about Jesus Christ, or about Christ. Is he the savior? About soteriology. So how are we going to be saved? They are so closely interrelated. The Gospel of Marcion and these letters of Paul, the 10 letters of Paul, particularly the 7, yeah, that there is a very clear relation. But I would suggest we do another session, particularly for a comparison between the theology of the 10 letters of Paul in Marcion and the 14 letters of Paul in the Canonical collection. But I think we are already almost 2 hours on stream, and I'm thinking not just of our viewers, but also of ourselves.
Yeah, let's definitely set that up sometime. I would also like to do a show with you at some point soon about going back to the 2nd century dating of the 4 canonical gospels, because there are people that will come out and say that because they'll say, "Oh, well, doesn't Mark say that some of you will not taste death before you see the Son of Man?" And they'll say that, "Oh, that must be shortly after 70 AD." So I'd like to go through that and show why that reasoning doesn't really hold up as much as they.
But we can talk about it. I think it would be worth doing it. We had a very interesting session on Patristica 2 days ago with Barry Strauss, who just published a very solid and interesting book about the 3 Jewish revolts. He talks about not just 2, but 3, because he takes the Jewish revolt from Alexandria in 117 as revolt 2, which is correct. And so we talked also about where best to place the Gospels, because he hasn't dealt with that in his book. So he's really just a Jewish historian on that, or Roman historian, military historian. But I'd be happy to talk to you also about this question.
We got a couple of more super chat questions.
Yeah,
JC, thank you for your super chat. Joined late, so the canonical redaction of Apostolos' 10 letters, Evangelion and adding Acts, was a counter Marcion movement. Is Paul Marcion's alter ego?
Yeah, we had that just in the question before. To some extent, I think is the Paul of the 10 letter collection an alter ego of Marcion, but I wouldn't take that too far. I mean, I gave a few hints which were hypothetical, but I do think he earned and he received 2 letter collections which he took serious. So I would not stress or overstress the self-interpretation of Marcion into Paul as an alter ego. I think it's pretty much the other way around. He found these letters. He was deeply impressed by these letters, as we still are today, even in the revised version of the canonical form. And so he got obsessed with these texts, and probably this was the springboard for then also looking for this gospel material, and which he then also found, and he must also have been impressed by those. And you don't spend your life as a business person like him in then opening a teaching house, and coming up with this new message, the New Testament, absolutely obsessed. It's not easy work. I mean, it was hard work for reconstructing it, but it was certainly hard work in the first instance to do the redaction and to publish that and to invest time and money at the time. So only to some extent, I think, an alter ego, rather somebody who was reformed. So it's not a Saul Paul conversion, but it is a deep inner reforming himself according to these texts. Because if I'm not mistaken, he was a Jew. And then to see the writings of a Jew who is so different. Yeah, okay, there are parallels to Flavius Josephus, there are parallels to Philo of Alexandria. So he was certainly a Greek Jew. But he must have seen these letters as taking the Jewish thinking so far further than everything that existed before, that he got struck with it and set his life on it. But I thought I forgot the first part of your question. Sorry.
I'll pull it back up.
The counter movement. Yeah, I'm not the only one who has seen that, for example, the preface of Luke, just as the preface of Acts, which we have mentioned a few times now in this last 2 hours, has anti-Marcionite notions. Then it's often been discussed, but if you see it in the collection, you can see that 1 Timothy 6:20, where even the title of Marcion's New Testament is being mentioned, literally mentioned. It talks about the antitheses. People have always been skeptical whether that is really a reference to Marcion's preface, because it also talks about the genealogical myths. Now, genealogical myths are related not to Marcion, but to Valentinus. But then Valentinus was a co-teacher of Marcion in Rome. And it is clear that the pastoral letters, just like Irenaeus, have not only one target. So it's not anti-Marcion alone. It is always anti-Marcion and anti-Valentinian. The Valentinian side is always more the theological, Christological side. But the anti-Marcionite side is the literal, it's the writing part, because the Valentinians haven't created their own New Testament. They also relied on what Marcion produced.
Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. Why early Catholic Church needs a Paul? Fight rampant Roman decadence?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think Paul was needed. Yeah, Paul. First of all, these early Christians didn't have the big choice of literature. They could have picked the shepherd Hermas. Hermas has a few manuscripts that survived, so it was a writing which was distributed. But it's a highly complex text. It's very elusive. It's imagery, but it hasn't got that concreteness that Paul in his letters has. And these letters are like guidelines, how to behave, how to construct a community, how to guide a community, what to do and what not to do. And those letters, therefore, were very powerful. So why the church needed it? Usually when you create a novel cult, you give this cult a form of guidelines. We have colleagues like Heidi Wendt and others who have worked on religious entrepreneurs who have started new cults in the hundreds of years before Christ and after Christ. And one of the typical features is you have to make an endowment, so it needs money, but it also needs guidelines and location. And this is exactly what we here have. And like the Gospels, I think the Pauline texts were serving the church as guidelines. And that's why it was so useful. And of course, useful against the decadence. Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, we are living in a time where, like in Titus, what does he do with the money which he steals from the Temple of Jerusalem after sacking it? He invests in games. It's like today. The best you can earn money, create a game industry.
Solar Knight, thank you for another super chat. Emperor Claudius sits him as God in Jewish temple.
Yeah, that's only a hint that we have that he erects something in the Jewish temple. And
Actually, he has another super chat. I think he corrected to Emperor Caligula as God in the Jewish temple.
that was the mention which I referred to in the early years. Yeah, we don't know much about that. This is always inferred by colleagues because we have this information that after, or in this eschatological elements in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels, that particularly in Luke, that something stood on the temple after it was raised. And we know from Josephus that after the year 70, nothing stood on the temple. The Jewish temple was razed. It was burned down, and according to Josephus, there was nothing left. There was also no statue, nothing. Only with Hadrian was then a statue of Zeus being built there in the refurbishing of the Temple Mountain and in refurbishing of the city of Jerusalem, which then became banned for all circumcised Jews. And hence, scholars who have been pretty conservative about this information, they said, well, if we ever want to take this eschatological writing in the canonical Gospels as a basis for making historical reference, we cannot do it as a reference to the end of the First Jewish War. Then we would rather have to take it as a reference to the Second Jewish War, because only then something stood there. They, of course, made that claim to say, well, these Gospels are not from the year 70, they are from the years 50 or of straight after Jesus' death. So you can see it's a hard nut to crack. I think, unfortunately, from the very few hints that we have, we can hardly say when these texts were written. Well, just what we know is that in the year 140, Marcion's New Testament saw the light, and hence then those texts were available.
JC, thank you for your super chat. What exactly led Dr. Vinzent to change his mind about Marcion's offer of 10 letters? If not him, who? Livesey makes good case for fictional works. Thank you.
Well, it was not so much a change of mind as whether or not Marcion was the author. I've never believed that Marcion was the author of 10 letters. My change of mind was with regards to the authorship of the Gospel, just to correct that. But I think because in Galatians 5:21, we have the mentioning that flesh and blood don't inherit the kingdom of heaven. And this verse is introduced by saying, as I have said before. Now, Galatians is the first letter. And nowhere in Galatians does he earlier in the letter say that. But in 1 Corinthians 15:50, there he says explicitly the same thing, that flesh and blood is not going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. However, 1 Corinthians is placed after Galatians. Hence, the back reference in Galatians goes into the wrong direction. And this can only explain or be explained by him relying on a collection of letters which he has in front of him, where these back references was already part, and where the back reference was correct, which means he must have made use of a collection of letters where 1 Corinthians stood before Galatians. That is the first clear hint for us to say he is not the author of these 10 letters, but he makes use of a letter collection where they have the inverted order, 1 Corinthians before Galatians. And if that's the case, I think the 7 letters that he uses were in the same order as we have it later in the canonical collection. So he seems to have derived these letters from where we don't know, certainly not from the canonical milieu, because the language is so different, but it must have been already a somehow collection of those 7 letters in the order that at least 1 Corinthians stood before Galatians. That's what made my change of mind, that he's not collecting individual letters. That I always believed until I made the reconstruction and until I came across this wrong back reference. That was the major reason. And it makes a lot of sense, because that also explains that he not only makes, which I believed before, 3 letters as a collection, but he makes use of 2 letter collections.
So I'm going to ask a couple more questions and then we will close. My first question is, my first of the last 2 questions is, when you look at the early references to Paul, the early citations of Paul, are they citing more explicitly from the Marcionite edition than the canonical edition?
Give me the second question too, and then I'll answer them both together.
My second question is, do you think that Paul wrote the earlier collection that began with 1 Corinthians, or you're not sure about that?
Brilliant. Okay, so the one question goes further back in time, and the other one is about reception. It's interesting that almost exclusively, not exclusively, but almost exclusively, the people in the 2nd century that quote Paul according to a canonical Paul. That's for sure. However, it's not a canonical Paul of 14 letters, but a canonical Paul of only 10 letters. So my suspicion is that the manuscripts that Origen talks about, which are canonical Pauline letters, but these are letters which are just like Romans, have only 14 chapters, so 15 and 16 chapter are missing. So are the pastoral letters and Hebrews missing in these canonical manuscripts of canonical Pauline letters. And that tells me that we have an intermediate form of canonical letters, which are only having 10 letters, not 14. And even though these 10 letters are not entirely of the consistency and with the content of the 14 letter collection. And I give you a few examples where I think we can see that. Nobody in the times before Irenaeus quotes Romans 13, 1-7. So that we should pray and obey the government appears to be also, like Romans 15, 16, something that came on top. So many other chapters are being hinted at or even appear in these authors, but neither Romans 15, 16 nor Romans 13, 1-7. Another chunk which is never hinted at or makes use of is 2 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. Good example. The collection for Jerusalem is never hinted at by nobody until Irenaeus. If this had been not a historical fiction, if this had been reality, why has nobody, where it's about money, nobody makes any reference? And apparently, even afterwards, in history, There's no continuation of the money collection for Jerusalem. Nobody complains about it, that in the end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century, that the money collection for Jerusalem has dried out. It's a chimera. It's a historical fiction. It's never been used, continued, complained about. Nobody, nothing. So reception. Yes, we have a reception, but we have that reception of a 10-letter collection which has undergone a second revision, a substantial revision, a broadening by chapters and verses when the pastoral letters, Acts, and Hebrews were added. For example, even Philippians 4 is never been mentioned before, and it has, with the people there, all the likelihood that these were also added in the later second redaction when those other 4 letters were added. Let me come to the other question. Who has written those letters? When we can go one step back from Marcion and say he makes use of 2 collections, one that derives from the canonical milieu, from the school of Polycarp, the other 7 letters from a background which we don't know, not yet. Then we have to admit both are collections, and every collection does not give us authentic material. It's always redacted. The redaction starts by putting letters in a certain order, as we've just seen. So if that collection starts with Romans and not with Galatians, the collection has a different thrust and a different message, gives a different meaning to texts. So it has undergone a certain redaction. Now we can only ask ourselves if these 7 letters have been written by a historical Paul, then has this historical Paul also put together that 7-letter collection? Only then we would have some, let's say, historical authenticity. But if Marcion puts together his collection after the Second Jewish War, how far back goes that earlier collection? Does it go back? Well, not during the war, but earlier, prior to that war. How much does it go back? Does it go back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years? And here one would need to say, the earlier we place that earlier collection, the more we have to explain where's the reception, because we don't see any reception. Marcion is the earliest we know of. So I doubt that these 7 letters go back too much of the years or too many years. So that's my restriction. Maybe we find out a bit more in the future to what extent we can reckon that in those 7 letters, and probably also in the 3 letters, we have material that might go back to a earlier stage even, and might relate back to a historical Paul. I don't know. What Livesey says is that all of these letter collections normally are rather put together as fictional letters, as I had the example with Plato and others. So we have to be, we have to give the doubt first some credibility before we start believing or hypothesizing about the historical author. Having said that, I'm also always skeptical if texts of that clever nature, as we have them in the 7 letters, even in the redacted form as we have them, that these are just picked from the air, then we would reckon or need to reckon with an extremely gifted Jewish writer of a caliber of Josephus, of a caliber of Philo of Alexandria. And if that is the case, then what is the difference between calling him an anonymous redactor or calling him Paul? I don't see much difference. And in that sense, the question then only is the person who is writing these letters just writing from his fictional memory, an invention? And if so, why? Or is that a reflection of a sort of historical reality? But the answer I cannot give today. Maybe we find out more once we a bit deeper into these texts.
And I'd like to remind everybody real quick that the link to the book From Paul to Saul, the German edition, it will be linked in the description below and also in the pinned comment. The English version of it will be added once it comes out. And also, I have the Patristica YouTube channel tagged in the description below, and it will also be found in the pinned comment. With that being said, Marcus, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to discuss with you. Thank you. And also with the audience. Yeah, thank you so much.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.